By the time the woman reached Gideon Vale's porch, the baby in her arms had gone so quiet he could hear only the rasp of her own breath and the iron chime of her stirrup against the post. She tried to hand the child over before she said her name, but what came out first was a broken whisper. "This baby isn't safe with me." The porch boards were still warm from the day, but the evening wind coming down off the bighorns had teeth in it. Gideon had been standing by the hitch rail with a lantern in one hand and a halter in the other, watching one of the stable boys fail to catch a skittish sorrel mare. He turned at the sound of that voice and saw a woman with alkali dust up the hem of her dress, one glove missing, a split in her lower lip, and a child wrapped in a blue blanket so tightly only one small fist showed. Before we go any further, settle in wherever you are tonight, and let us know in the comments what corner of the world you're listening from. There is something good about knowing who is sitting by the fire with us. Gideon set the lantern down and took the child first. He did it the way a man handles a frightened colt, steady hands, no fuss, no wasted motion. The baby stirred once, made a weak sound, then pressed her cheek against the wool of his coat as if she had decided he was solid enough to sleep on. Gideon looked down at the tiny face, then back at the woman. "Who's after you?" She swayed where she stood. "If I say his name out here, he'll hear it by morning." That told him enough to know fear had been with her a while. He lifted his chin toward the open door. "Come inside." The big house at Blackstone Ranch was known clear to Sheridan and beyond. Folks called Gideon Vale the Millionaire Cowboy because he could buy half the county twice over and still count his cattle by the thousands. But money had never managed to make the place feel grand. It smelled of coffee, saddle soap, cedar smoke, and clean floorboards. No velvet curtains. No crystal nonsense. Just a long table, a stone hearth, and chairs built to hold tired people. Mrs. Nettle, his cook, looked up from the stove, flour dusting her forearms to the elbow. "Mercy. Hot water," Gideon said. "And milk if there's any fresh." Mrs. Nettle moved without another word. She had the kind of face trouble made practical years ago. The woman stepped inside, as if expecting the room to reject her. She was younger than Gideon had first thought, maybe 28, maybe 30, though grief had a way of laying extra winters across a face. Her dark hair had come loose under her bonnet. There was mud on one sleeve and dried blood at the cuff. Gideon pointed toward the chair nearest the fire. "Sit before you fall." She sat because she had no choice left in her. Only then did he notice the silver watch chain pinned inside her collar. Not jewelry. A man's chain, plain and worn smooth at the edge from years in a pocket. Gideon knew it before he remembered why. "Where'd you get that?" Her fingers went to it at once, protective. "It was my husband's." "What was his name?" "Caleb Mercer." The room went still around that name. Gideon had not heard it in nearly 4 years. Not since a spring drive turned bad and a younger man with laughing eyes had shoved him clear of a falling gate and taken a broken collarbone for his trouble. Caleb Mercer had spent 6 weeks on this ranch healing, talking little, observing much. Before he left, he had told Gideon one thing about himself worth remembering. "If I ever have a family," he had said, "and something happens to me, I want them near decent people." Gideon looked at the woman again. "You're Caleb's wife." "Widow," she said, and the words seemed to scrape her throat on the way out. "As of 9 days ago." Mrs. Nettle brought warmed goat's milk in a bottle with a rag around it and hovered long enough to see the baby latch. The sound of that swallowing in the room made something ease, if only a little. Gideon pulled out the chair opposite the woman and Saturday started at the point that matters most. She kept her eyes on the child. "My husband worked the books for Vane Consolidated in town. Silver, cattle loans, land notes. His uncle owned it. Silas Vane." Gideon knew the name. Everybody did. Silas Vane had the polished manners of a church deacon and the soul of a carrion crow. He lent money in dry years, took ranches in wet ones, and never raised his voice because men with real power rarely needed to. "My husband found something in those books," the woman said. "I don't know all of it. Only that he came home 3 weeks ago scared in a way I had never seen. He told me if anything happened to him, I was to go nowhere near the sheriff, burn the red ledger if I had to, and ride for Blackstone. He wrote your name himself." She reached into her reticule and laid a folded paper on the table. "Then he was found crushed beneath in or cart behind the warehouse." Gideon unfolded the note. The writing was Caleb's, all right. Quick hand, honest strokes. "If Mara reaches you, help her. Don't weigh it. Just help her." The child is the reason. Gideon looked up. The child is whose reason? Mara's face changed when she turned toward the baby. It softened and broke at the same time. Her name is Elspeth. She's 7 months old. And she is the lawful heir to 43 acres along Cottonwood Creek, plus the water rights beneath it, left through my husband's mother. Silas Vane has been trying to buy those rights for years because the railroad surveyors ran through there in the spring. Caleb refused. After Caleb died, Silas came to the house himself. Said grief made women foolish. Said a child deserved a stronger guardian than a mother who didn't know how the world worked. And you believed he meant to take her. I believed worse. Her hands clenched in her lap. Last night I heard somebody in the nursery. Not stealing silver. Not looking for money. Standing over her crib. I took up the coal shovel and screamed before he could touch her. He ran. Left the back gate swinging. Gideon did not interrupt. This morning the sheriff came with a paper saying I was not in a fit state to care for my own daughter. Said there'd be a hearing in town by week's end. Said Mr. Vane had petitioned temporary guardianship for the child's protection. She laughed once, and there was no humor in it. Protection. Mrs. Nettle muttered something low and unprintable into the stew pot. Gideon folded Caleb's note and slid it into his vest pocket. Why say she isn't safe with you? If Vane wants her, safer with you is the whole point. Mara stared at the fire until the answer looked dragged out of her. Because every place I take her, he follows. Every decent soul who helps me gets marked. My husband is dead. My neighbor lost 2 milk goats this morning because she let me cross her pasture in the dark. And if Silas decides I cannot be bent, then the easiest way to finish this is to bury the baby and call it fever. Her voice went thin. So I brought her here because Caleb trusted you more than he trusted the law. The words had hardly settled when hoofbeats sounded hard in the yard. Not one horse. 3. Gideon rose before Mrs. Nettle did. He took the Winchester from the hooks above the hearth, worked the lever once, then set the muzzle low and walked to the door. Out past the porch, 3 riders had stopped under the cottonwoods. One of them wore a sheriff's badge that caught the lantern light. Sheriff Lorne Pritchard was a narrow man with a habit of touching the toothpick at the corner of his mouth when he lied. He did it now. Evening, Vale, he called. Heard a woman in some distress might have come through here. Gideon rested one shoulder against the frame. You hear all kinds of things. Then you heard right helpful, I hope. Widow Mercer's not well. There's concern for the child. There's always concern for children, Gideon said. Mostly from the wrong men. Pritchard's jaw tightened. Careful now. Been careful all my life. The sheriff leaned in the saddle. Mr. Vane has legal interest in the child's welfare. Mr. Vane has legal interest in whatever can be sold out from under the helpless, Gideon said. That ain't the same thing. One of the other riders shifted. Gideon saw the hand near his holster and lifted the rifle just enough to make the distance feel longer. Ride back to town, he said, quiet as winter. Tell Silas Vane Caleb Mercer's widow is under my roof tonight. If he wants to challenge that, he can do it in daylight and in front of witnesses. He shut the door before they answered. When he turned back, Mara was standing in the middle of the room, white as lard, the baby clutched against her shoulder again. Gideon looked at her, at the split lip, the shaking hands, the child with one tiny fist curled in the wool of her mother's dress, and knew without ceremony that the line had been crossed. His ranch, his men, his hard-kept peace. None of it was intact anymore. Mrs. Nettle, he said, put them in the blue room. Then to Mara, more gently. Nothing goes back to the way it was after tonight. You understand that. A tear slipped free before she could stop it. I understood it before I knocked. The blue room faced east toward the lower pasture and the creek beyond. By dawn the frost had silvered the windows, and Blackstone Ranch had already begun choosing sides. Tobin Reed, Gideon's foreman, stood in the tack room rubbing his thumb over the brim of his hat until the felt darkened with sweat. I'm not saying send her away, he said. I'm saying men got wives here. Boys, Vane will make an example if pushed. Gideon was oiling a saddle cinch. He's made examples his whole life. That's why folks still bend. And if the law comes with paper, then paper had best be read proper. Tobin hesitated. She can even read it proper? The question cost him more than he knew. Mara answered it herself an hour later. Mrs. Nettle had set her at the kitchen table with coffee black enough to put feeling back in a dead man. Elspeth slept in a wooden drawer lined with quilts beside the stove, because babies, Mrs. Nettle said, had spent generations sleeping in stranger places than that and turned out fine. Mara's face still showed the ride, but there was strength under the weariness now, the kind that came out when fear had finally found a wall to lean against. Gideon laid the sheriff's copy of the petition before her. "Tell me what you see." She read the page once through without moving her lips. Then again, slower. Her finger came to rest on a line near the bottom. This valuation was changed. Gideon pulled out the chair across from her. "How can you tell?" "Because the 7 in 70 was made from a 1. She pushed the paper toward him. "The stroke is heavier on the left. Different ink, too. And this note here says my husband assigned future mineral interest to Silas Vane as collateral against household debt. Caleb never would have done that. He hated owing money. Also, the amount listed would have covered our expenses for 20 years. We owed $38 at the mercantile and $9 to the doctor. I know because I keep figures in my head the way some women keep hymns." Mrs. Nettle snorted. A gift if ever there was one. Mara barely seemed to hear. She had gone very still, eyes fixed on the paper. "There are 4 clerks in town who know this hand is wrong. 3 will lie. 1 won't if made to swear before a room full of people." Gideon watched her, then the way men watched the horizon when weather turned interesting. Caleb had written books for a man like Silas Vane because he needed the work. His wife had been reading over his shoulder the whole while, invisible enough for powerful men to forget she was there. Gideon understood something important in that moment. Mara Mercer had not come to him empty-handed. She had come armed with the one thing men, like Silas, feared most: accurate memory. By noon word had spread through the ranch and over the creek to the neighboring spreads. Reactions arrived by boot and horse and casserole alike. Old Mrs. Caro from the next place overcame with a basket of eggs and a face like dried apple leather. "My first husband was robbed by a smiling man," she said to Mara without introduction. "Second one by a banker. Learned to distrust polished boots." Then she kissed Elspeth's brow and went home. At the feed store in town, Gideon's regular order was delayed because the clerk had been unable to locate the invoice. At the chapel, 2 women who had once invited Mara to Sewing Circle crossed the street rather than look at her when she rode past under escort to fetch her own trunk. People did not need full knowledge to become cruel. Rumor served just fine. That afternoon, Gideon found Mara in the yard beside a half-broken dun gelding that nobody but him could usually touch. The horse had cut a wild circle around the corral and come up sweating, eyes white, rope trailing. "Don't," Tobin warned from the fence. "He'll strike." Mara ignored him. She picked up the rope with slow hands and spoke so softly Gideon could not make out the words. Not to calm the animal with sweetness. To meet him where he was. The gelding blew once, hard. She waited. Dust stirred around the hem of her skirt. After a long half-minute the horse lowered his head an inch. Then another. She stepped in close enough to lay her palm between his eyes. When she turned, there was a little color in her face for the first time. "He was fought with heavy hands," she said. "He expects pain before touch." Gideon looked at the quiet horse, then at her. "You know stock. My father traded mules till drink took the sense from him. Somebody had to keep the animals from learning his temper." That evening, after supper, Mara stood over Elspeth's makeshift bed and said, "You should send me somewhere else before your people pay for this." Gideon was at the sideboard rolling Caleb's note open and shut in one hand. "Where?" "A church mission. A widow's place. Anywhere smaller. So Vane can take you easier? So he stops using your ranch to make his point." Gideon set the note down. "Caleb once hauled me clear of a gate that should have killed me. Cost him a shoulder and 6 weeks' work. I asked why he did it. Know what he said?" She shook her head. "He said a man ought to be able to sleep beside his own conscience." Gideon looked toward the drawer where Elspeth slept. "I have slept beside worse things than trouble. Trouble doesn't scare me near as much as failing a dead friend." Mara leaned one hand on the table, as if the room had shifted under her. "You speak like the choice is simple. It ain't simple." He looked straight at her. "It's just clear." Later, while Mrs. Nettle knit by the fire and the house settled into its night sounds, Mara found Gideon in the mudroom mending a latch. The lamplight turned the scar at his temple pale. "You ever marry?" she asked before she could stop herself. He kept working a moment. "I did." Something in the quiet that followed told her the rest had not ended well. "She and the baby died in a March storm 12 years ago," he said. "Doc was snowed in at Buffalo. I could have ridden sooner for help. Didn't. Thought morning would do. His jaw hardened once. Morning did not. Mara's hand went to her throat. Gideon drove in the last nail and tested the latch. Some folks think a closed gate means safety. Mostly it means you get good at being alone. That line sat between them a long while. By the second morning, the storm Gideon had expected arrived without weather to announce it. Sheriff Pritchard came back, this time with a formal summons for a guardianship hearing set 2 days later. He rode in with 6 men and a smile too pleased for lawful business. Judge Holloway wants the mother and child present, he said. Failure to appear will be taken poorly. By the judge or by Vane? Gideon asked. Pritchard touched the toothpick. These matters can blur. Gideon took the paper. Before he could turn away, smoke lifted from the far end of the bunkhouse roof. Men shouted. A horse screamed. The stable had caught first, then the dry hay beside it. By the time they formed a bucket line from the pump, flame had crawled along the wall beams like something with intelligence. Mara came running across the yard with Elspeth in her arms, bareheaded, the child wailing at last. Gideon saw at once where the fire had started. Not from lamp or stove. From oil thrown high, where it would climb fastest. Tobin and the hands beat back sparks from the corral, while Gideon dragged 2 panicked geldings clear. Smoke clawed at the throat. Heat punched the eyes blind. When at last the roof gave way, and the blaze settled to a red chew and hiss, the sheriff had already gone. On the blackened ground, near the back wall, Gideon found what he had expected to find. A smashed bottle that smelled of kerosene. That night, with the taste of ash still in every breath, he laid the summons flat on the table between them. If we don't go, Mara said, Vane wins by absence. If we do go, he may win by arrangement. Mrs. Nettle fed another stick to the fire. Then quit talking like those are the only 2 roads. Gideon looked up. The old woman jerked her chin toward Mara. Her husband didn't die over a single paper. Men don't burn barns over something they already own. There's more proof somewhere. Mara pressed her fingers to her brow. Caleb kept 1 red ledger at the office and another set of numbers in a school primer at home. He said nobody steals what looks dull. Her eyes widened. The primer. Where? In the cedar chest under our bed. I left with the baby and the blanket, and that was all. Gideon stood. Then we fetch it before dawn. He looked from the burned rafters outside to the woman at his table and the child breathing in sleep at her breast, and his face settled into the kind of calm that frightened bad men more than anger ever could. Then, because stories ask us things long before they answer them, let me ask you one in the middle of this hard place. If the law had already sold you, would you still ride toward the courthouse? Or would you take the child and disappear into the hills? Tell me true in the comments, because there are choices that sound simple only until they become yours. They left while the stars were still hard above the pasture. Gideon rode first. Mara followed with Elspeth bound close against her beneath Gideon's heavy coat. Tobin came as far as the cottonwoods, then peeled west to circle high and watch the ridge. The plan was clean. Reach town before full light. Slip to the Mercer place at the edge of Cottonwood Creek. Get the primer. Get out. Plans stayed clean only until other people touched them. Mara's house sat small and white behind a picket fence with 2 broken slats. A child's laundry line still ran from the porch post to the lilac bush, a pair of tiny socks hanging there stiff with weather. Mara stopped at the sight of them as if struck. You stay with the horses, Gideon said. She shook her head. Not a chance. The front room smelled of cold iron and old grief. Somebody had searched already. Drawers yanked out. Crockery broken. Mattress slit. But the bedroom door stood as Mara had left it. Maybe because men hunting papers rarely knelt to ask what a woman values enough to hide beneath her own blankets. She dropped by the cedar chest and lifted out quilts with frantic, careful hands. At the bottom lay a primer with blue cardboard covers and a cracked spine. There, she whispered. She opened it. Pages had been hollowed at the center. Inside were folded sheets, a bank receipt, and a narrow strip of telegraph paper. Gideon took one glance and swore under his breath. Caleb copied transfer numbers. He copied everything. Mara said, breath quickening. Oh, Caleb. A floorboard creaked in the front room. Both of them froze. Gideon moved first, pushing Mara behind the bed as the bedroom door flew inward, and 2 men came through, faces muffled with kerchiefs. The first swung a club. Gideon caught the wrist, drove him into the doorframe, and the room exploded into short, brutal motion. No grand heroics. Just impact. A chair breaking. A curse. Mara pulling Elspeth tight as the baby cried in terrified gasps. The second man lunged for the primer. Mara snatched the flat iron from the washstand and brought it down across his knuckles hard enough to make bone crack. He howled. Then a shot went off from the yard. Horses burst into panic outside. Gideon shoved one attacker into the other and ran for the porch. Through the doorway, Mara saw Silas Vane sitting his horse at the gate in a dark city coat that did not belong on Wyoming dust. He did not look like a man who had come to brawl. He looked like a man arriving at church late on purpose, so all eyes would turn. "Mrs. Mercer," he called, smooth as cream. "This has become ugly enough." She stood in the bedroom doorway with the baby and the primer against her ribs. "You made it ugly when you murdered Caleb." He smiled at that, thin and insulted. "Your husband was sentimental. He thought figures had morals." Gideon came onto the porch with blood at one eyebrow and a revolver in his hand. Silas looked at the gun the way a banker looks at mud. "You won't shoot me in front of a child," Silas said. "No," Gideon answered, "but I might improve my morning considerably." For one shining second, Mara thought they had him. Then Elspeth gave a sudden choking cough behind her, the frightened hitch of a baby who had cried too hard and swallowed wrong. Mara turned on instinct. That single turn cost everything. One of the men Gideon had dropped was not finished. He crashed out from the side of the porch, seized Mara by the shoulder, and tore the child from her arms so violently the blue blanket unwound in the air. Mara screamed. Gideon fired once. The man spun but did not fall. He threw himself toward Silas's horse, clutching Elspeth like stolen money. Silas wheeled his mount. Gideon fired again. This time the horse reared. Dust flew. A third rider came out of the alley behind the house and sent a shot through the porch rail. Mara ran, blind with terror, and almost went down the steps headfirst. Gideon caught her around the waist before she could throw herself beneath the horses. She beat at him with both fists. "Let me go. You'll die before you reach them. That is my baby." Silas Vane rode out through the gate with Elspeth screaming in another man's arms, and the sound of it followed them down the road like something ripping in two. Gideon mounted before the dust settled. "Take the papers," he said. "I'm coming. You can't ride into a gun line carrying proof and grief with the same hands. I can if you mean to bring my daughter back." He looked at her once, saw there would be no moving her from that decision, and gave a sharp nod. "Then stay on my left and do exactly as I say." They took the north cut toward Dry Woman Creek because Silas would choose the faster road to town and the cover of the poplars beyond it. Gideon read sign at a run the way other men read headlines. "Fresh shoe nick on limestone. Broken sage. One horse carrying extra weight." He leaned low over the saddle. Every line of him narrowed into purpose. The gunfire began where the wash pinched between two shelves of rock. 3 shots from ahead, 1 from behind. "Tobin," Gideon said under his breath, hearing the answer shot from the ridge. So the foreman had done more than wring his hat after all. The next minute came in flashes. Gideon dropping from the saddle to drag Mara and her horse into the shelter of a boulder. Dust jumping from stone. Elspeth's cries, faint now and farther up the cut. A rider toppling sideways when Tobin's rifle found him. Gideon looking around the rock and firing once, twice. Each shot measured, never hurried. Then pain crossed his face in a way Mara had not yet seen. He sat back hard. Hit. Shoulder. Blood darkened his coat. A sane man might have slowed. Gideon Vale got back on the horse using one arm and his teeth and kept riding. They found the child at the line shack above the creek. Silas's wounded man had made it that far and no farther. He lay half in the doorway, shot through the chest, not by Gideon. By Silas, Mara understood at once. Dead men did not confess bad errands. Elspeth was inside on a pile of sacking, crying with the exhausted fury only babies can sustain. Mara dropped to her knees and gathered her up, and for a moment the whole world narrowed to milk breath, hot tears, and the wild pounding of a tiny heart against her own. She kissed Elspeth's damp face again and again until the child quieted enough to hiccup. When she looked up, Gideon was bracing one hand against the door jamb, gray around the mouth. "We move," he said. "Silas won't stop at one failure." He was right, but the body had its own truths. By the time they reached the higher line cabin hidden among lodgepole pine, Gideon was barely staying upright. Mara got him inside, shut the bar across the door, and stripped his coat off with hands that shook less than she expected. The bullet had gone through the flesh high in the shoulder and out clean, which was luck if a person still believed in it. Mara boiled water, tore linen, and worked by lamplight while Elspeth slept in a basket beside the stove, one thumb still damp from self-comfort. Gideon did not make a sound until she pressed the clean cloth to the wound. Then his breath caught. "Sorry," she whispered. "You are doing fine." "No. I brought this to your house. To your men. To you." He turned his head enough to look at her. "Silas brought it. Don't hand him the courtesy of carrying his blame." The room was small and smelled of pine resin, lamp oil, and blood. Wind sifted at the chinks in the logs. Mara bound the shoulder tightly, tied the knot, then sat back on her heels because suddenly there was nothing left in her bones. "When I came to your porch," she said, eyes on the floorboards, "I wasn't afraid of myself. Not the way you think. I never meant I would harm her. I meant men die around me. Houses burn. Anybody who stands too close gets broken. After Caleb," she swallowed. "After they put him in the ground, people kept looking at me as if widowhood was catching. I started to think maybe disaster knows my name." Gideon rested his head against the wall. His voice, when it came, was quieter than the fire. Bad men are skilled at making a woman feel like the storm followed her in. Truth is, they were the storm all along. Mara covered her face with one hand, and the tears she had outrun since town finally found her. He waited them out, not with false comfort, with presence. After a while he said, "Look at me." She did. "A heart doesn't mend straight," he said. "It knits where it can, and if it still holds when the cold comes, that counts for grace." That was the moment she broke open and began, at last, to heal. She told him about her father's drinking and the mule lot, about marrying Caleb because he was the first man who had ever asked her opinion and then listened as if it mattered. Gideon told her about May, who had laughed with her whole body and hated curtains, and about the child he had never held alive. He had built Blackstone larger after that, as if enough walls and acreage could keep loss from finding him again. It had not worked. Mara touched the scar at his temple with 2 fingertips, gentle as rain. "You kept your promise. I haven't finished keeping it." Their foreheads rested together for one small borrowed second, the kind that changes the temperature of a life. No hurry, no grand declaration. Just 2 tired people recognizing the shape of home in a place they had stopped expecting to find it. If this part of the story is moving something tender in you, then you are exactly who it was written for. A like and a subscribe tell us to keep bringing stories where broken people are not left broken forever. Near midnight, Tobin arrived at the cabin, face raw from wind, carrying news and a canvas satchel. "Silas is telling town you and the widow stole company property and kidnapped the child," he said to Gideon. "Hearing's still set for tomorrow. He means to take the papers as evidence once you walk through the door and then lock her up." Mara lifted the primer. "Not if I speak first." Tobin shook his head. "Judge Holloway won't hear you." "Then he'll hear numbers," she said. "And if he won't hear those, the room will." Gideon, pale but very much alive, pushed himself to sitting. "What's in the satchel?" Tobin laid out a folded county map, a notarized copy of the original water right filing he had fetched from the survey office in Buffalo, and Caleb's telegraph strip once Mara smoothed it flat. The telegram had been sent 2 days before Caleb died. To Territorial Banking Examiner, Cheyenne. Audit vein consolidated immediately. Evidence of forged collateral transfers, probate theft, and fraudulent seizure of widow holdings. If I am harmed, look to Silas Vane. Mara stared at the words until they steadied into anger. He knew he might not live long enough to send the proof himself. Gideon's eyes met hers. Then we finish what he started. Morning came clear and beautiful, which felt like an insult after such a night. The courthouse in Sheridan sat white and self-important at the end of Main Street. Men who had never lifted anything heavier than a fountain pen were already gathering on the steps by the time Gideon rode up with his arm in a sling, Mara at his side, and Elspeth bundled against her chest. Tobin brought the rear. Mrs. Nettle, astonishing everybody but Gideon, had come in a wagon behind them with half the neighboring women packed onto the bench like righteous artillery. Silas Vane stood at the foot of the steps in a dark coat, watch chain bright against his waistcoat, as if this were a social call arranged for his benefit. "You look worn, Vale," he said. "You look temporary," Gideon answered. "Inside," Judge Holloway took the bench with all the gravity of a man already bought and hoping nobody noticed the receipt. Sheriff Pritchard stationed himself near the door. The room filled with ranchers, clerks, wives, drifters, and 3 merchants Silas had cheated one way or another and did not realize remembered it. Silas rose first. Smooth voice. Concerned uncle. Unstable widow. Tragic accident. Child best protected by orderly management of assets until proper arrangements could be made. He even managed sorrow on Caleb's behalf without cracking. Then the judge asked whether the mother wished to respond, and likely expected tears. He got Mara Mercer instead. She stood with Elspeth in one arm and the primer in the other, a plain woman in a traveling dress still marked by dust and fear and one sleepless night, and the room shifted toward her without quite understanding why. My husband kept books for Mr. Vane, she said. He died because he noticed those books did not balance. She laid out the altered petition, the bank receipt, Caleb's copied figures, and the original filing from Buffalo one by one, not in a flurry but with the patience of a teacher setting slates before children. She explained how the stroke in the 7 had been altered, how mineral rights had been pledged against debts that never existed, how widow accounts, including her own, had been inflated then seized, how the company had been borrowing against children's inheritances by falsifying guardianship risk. She named dates, amounts, initials. Men in the room began shifting in their seats as their own dealings drifted into view. Mr. Vane counts on something, she said finally, voice ringing now. He counts on women not being taught numbers. He counts on poor men being too tired to ask where the money went. He counts on grief making fools of us. My husband died because he stopped counting the way Silas Vane wanted him to. Silas rose at once. This is theater. A widow's confusion. Then swear the ledger is clean, Mara said, turning to him. Swear it before every man you foreclosed on. Swear it before Mrs. Hargrove, whose late husband's grazing note you tripled after burial because you knew she could not read the terms. Swear it before the Caro boys, whose irrigation fee appears on page 6 after being paid in full. I remember every line, Mr. Vane. Shall I keep going? There was a rustle behind her as Mrs. Caro stood up in the back and said, loud as a church bell, keep going. Laughter broke sharp and mean at the edges of the room. Judge Holloway banged his gavel. Order. But order had already changed owners. Gideon stepped forward then, one hand on the back of a chair, his wounded shoulder bound beneath the coat. You asked for lawful interest, Your Honor. Here it is. He handed over Caleb's telegram to the banking examiner and Tobin's notarized survey copy. And if that does not satisfy the court, I'll be pleased to explain why Silas Vane's men burned my stable, assaulted a widow in her home, and stole her child in broad daylight. Silas lost the smoothness then, just for a blink, but the room saw it. That child was being recovered from a dangerous woman, he snapped. Mara's face went cold. Say that again while looking at her. He did not. Sheriff Pritchard took one step toward Mara, perhaps thinking to seize the papers while confusion held. Gideon moved faster than a wounded man had any right to move. He caught the sheriff's wrist, twisted the revolver clean free, and set it on the clerk's desk before Pritchard understood he had lost it. No more crooked hands today, Gideon said. What broke Silas in the end was not a gun. It was greed. He lunged for the documents himself, not because he was threatened, because he could not bear losing what he believed was already his. He grabbed the packet from the judge's hand and tore for the side door. Mara stepped into his path and did the last thing in the world he expected. She drove her boot heel down onto the hem of his expensive coat and held. Silas jerked back, off balance. Gideon did not rescue her. She did not need rescue. She hit him with the primer. It was only cardboard and paper. It should not have made much difference. But humiliation lands harder than iron on a man who has built his life on being untouchable. Silas stumbled. The papers burst from his hands like white birds. Tobin blocked the side door. Mrs. Nettle, of all people, thrust out one stout boot and caught his shin. He went down on the courthouse floor in full view of every person he had ever made small. When he tried to rise, 3 of those people were already speaking at once. A clerk admitted the signatures had been pressured. A merchant produced his own altered note from the previous winter. Mrs. Hargrove, who had been quiet for 2 years, stood trembling beside Mara and said, He stole my place after I buried my husband. Truth, once invited into a room, has a way of arriving in company. By afternoon, the banking examiner had been telegraphed. By evening, Sheriff Pritchard was stripped of his badge pending inquiry. Before the next week ended, Silas Vane's office was sealed, his accounts frozen, and enough evidence had crawled out of those ledgers to hang him legally for fraud, arson, conspiracy, and murder if the witnesses held. They held. The best part was this. He did not go down noble. He cursed. He begged. He named names. He claimed betrayal. Men who had tipped hats to him for 10 years watched him loaded into a wagon cage with his coat torn and courthouse dust across his knees. Everything he had used to crush others went with him. His money, his standing, his false, polished dignity. Gone. As for what came after, that was not magic. It was work. The Mercer water rights were secured in trust for Elspeth exactly as Caleb intended. The widow holding Silas had seized were reviewed one by one, and more than one family got land back they thought had vanished forever into somebody else's pocket. Blackstone's burn stable was rebuilt with pine cut from the North Draw, Tobin supervising with the solemnity of a man making up for hat-wringing. Mrs. Nettle took to calling Elspeth that little judge because the child had an alarming stare for one so small. And Mara did not leave. At first she stayed because the legal matters were not done and the nursery at her old house no longer felt like a place where breathing came easy. Then she stayed because Gideon, for all his silences, began leaving the best peach from the supper dish on the edge of her plate and pretending not to notice when she smiled. Then she stayed because one evening in the lower pasture he handed her the reins of a half-wild bay mare and said, "I trust your hands more than mine with this one." And something in her that had lived too long unwanted finally sat down and rested. The first time he kissed her, it was on the back steps while creek frogs started up in the dark and Elspeth slept with one hand tangled in Mrs. Nettle's apron strings inside. No fire. No performance. Just a man who had learned too late once and meant not to do that again. They were married in October under a clean blue sky, with the whole county watching and pretending not to cry. Years later, when folks told the story, some made much of the courthouse scene and some of the burned stable and the ride through Dry Woman Creek. Mara always shook her head at those versions. The story changed, she would say, the minute a tired man on a porch kept his word. And Gideon, if pressed, would say only, "Best bargain I ever made was with a woman who thought she was bringing me trouble." The good things came slowly after that, like spring water finding its way through stone, and that was how they knew they were built to last. 3 summers on, at the edge of evening, Elspeth ran barefoot through the new grass between the cottonwoods with a blue ribbon coming loose from her braid, while Mara laughed from the porch and Gideon leaned in the rail beside her, hat in one hand, the other resting over hers as the last light turned the creek to a band of gold below them. Next time, we'll tell the story of a deaf seamstress left at a snowbound ranch because her brothers said she was a burden, and the scarred cattleman who learned her silence could hear lies faster than any man in town.